We always said we'd never be the kind of couple who fell apart quietly. But in the end, that's exactly what we did. One ordinary moment at a time, until love became a habit. Habit became distance, and distance became the only thing left between us. Part 1. I almost didn't hear him walk in. The sound of his shoes on the hardwood floor was too soft, too careful. But when I turned around, there he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes not quite meeting mine. The tension between us was so thick, I could almost touch it. But we didn't say anything, not at first. It was supposed to be our night, our anniversary. And yet, as I stood there in the kitchen, arranging the plates, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in from every side. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city outside. It should have felt like home, like comfort. It had for so long. But tonight, it felt different, strange. Like the space between us had grown too wide to fill. I glanced at the clock. We were running late, as usual, but I couldn't bring myself to rush. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted to savor the last few moments before the night went wrong. When I looked back at the table, it was set perfectly. Candles flickering softly, wine glasses filled, the meal prepared with care. I'd done everything right, as I always did. But as I moved around the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, but the words felt trapped in my throat. Instead, I focused on the table, carefully adjusting the napkins. I forced myself to breathe. "Hey," I said after a long pause, my voice trying to sound casual. "Dinner's ready." Chris didn't answer right away. He just nodded, then walked past me without another word. His eyes lingered on the table, but not in a way that made me feel seen. More like he was checking off a box. Another thing to get through. I watched as he moved toward the wine bottle, uncorking it with an easy motion. His hands were steady, calm, but there was something distant about him, something colder than usual. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my stomach churn. "Do you want some?" he asked, his voice distant, his eyes still on the bottle as he poured. I didn't answer right away. What could I say? He didn't seem to care whether I did or not. "Yeah," I finally replied, my voice sounding quieter than I meant. "It's your favorite." He didn't acknowledge that, just nodded and took a sip from his glass. And for a moment, it felt like the distance between us had grown even wider. I took a deep breath and sat down across from him. The food was warm, the candles still flickering, but all I could feel was the hollow ache in my chest. "So, how's work?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I knew he wouldn't answer the way I wanted him to, but I had to try. "Same as usual," he said, his voice flat. "Busy. Tired." Tired. That was the word he always used, like it was an excuse for everything. But tonight, it didn't feel like enough. Not when he was sitting across from me like a stranger. I pushed the food around on my plate, pretending to care, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. I could feel the crack in our connection, growing wider with every passing second. "You don't seem like yourself," I said finally. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Chris looked up at me then, his eyes scanning my face, but not really seeing me. His lips pressed into a thin line, like he was fighting to hold something back. "I'm fine," he said, though his tone didn't match his words. It felt like an answer he'd rehearsed. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been for weeks, but tonight it was unbearable. I felt it in the way he wouldn't look at me for too long, in the way his answers were always just enough to keep me from asking more. It wasn't the way we used to be, it wasn't even close. But we ate. We pretended. And for a while, the only sound in the room was the clink of forks on plates and the occasional sip of wine. The weight of our silence was louder than anything else. After the meal, I cleared the plates, my movements automatic, while he stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. It was the same view we'd shared for years. Nothing had changed about that. But tonight, everything felt different. "Chris?" I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned, slowly, like he hadn't realized I'd been speaking. For a moment, he just looked at me, his gaze heavy, distant. And then he spoke. "Happy anniversary," he said, the words falling flat between us. My heart sank, but I forced a smile. "Happy anniversary." But the words felt wrong. The night felt wrong. Something had broken, and I wasn't sure if we could fix it anymore. I watched him, standing there, and suddenly it was all too clear. It wasn't just the tension, the quiet. It was the realization that we weren't who we used to be, that the love we once had was slipping through our fingers, and I didn't know how to hold on anymore. I wanted to ask him what was going on, to demand the truth, but I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear it. And so, as we stood there, two people who had once known each other so well now drifted apart in a room that used to feel like home. I tried to ignore the silence that filled the room. I tried to pretend it wasn't there, hovering in the space between us like a thick fog. But every time I glanced at Chris, it was all I could see. The distance that had crept in, so quietly, so slowly, that I hadn't even noticed it until now. He was still by the window, staring out at the city, his back to me. I wanted to say something, to break the stillness, but I didn't know what to say anymore. What was there to say when the truth was already hanging in the air, unspoken but undeniable? "Chris?" My voice came out soft, fragile. "Are you sure you're okay?" He didn't turn around at first, and I felt a pang in my chest. It was like he was somewhere far away, unreachable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, distant. "I told you, I'm fine." But I didn't believe him, not for a second. And the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself more than me, only made the ache in my chest grow deeper. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the room press down on me. The apartment, once filled with laughter and light, now felt empty. All the little things I used to cherish about this place, the way the sunlight would filter through the curtains in the morning, the smell of coffee that lingered in the air, felt like distant memories. Everything had changed without either of us realizing it. "What happened to us, Chris?" I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. There was no answer at first, just the sound of his breath, steady but uneven. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes met mine, but they didn't feel like my Chris's eyes. They were distant, like he was looking through me instead of at me. "It's not about you," he said quietly. "It's just, things have changed. I've changed." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing. "Changed how?" Chris took a deep breath, running his hand through his hair. His gaze flickered to the floor, like he was trying to find the right words, but the words weren't coming. It was the first time I had seen him look so unsure, so lost. "I don't know," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know where to start." The pain of that hit me like a slap to the face. He didn't know how to fix this. And I didn't either. I wanted to say something, to beg him to find a way, to hold on. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew we were both too far gone to find our way back. We had both stopped trying a long time ago, without even realizing it. "I don't want to give up on us," I said, my voice breaking as I took a step toward him. "I love you, Chris, I really do." He didn't step back, but he didn't move forward either. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. And for a moment, I thought he might say something that would change everything. But he didn't. Instead, he took another slow, deliberate sip from his wine glass, his eyes never leaving the floor. "I know you do. I just don't know if it's enough anymore." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than the silence had ever been. I felt my heart splinter at the edges, each word driving another crack into the fragile shell of what was left of us. I wanted to scream, to demand that he fix it, to tell him that we could try again. But I didn't, because I knew that deep down, neither of us had the strength to try anymore. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I don't know what we're supposed to do now." Chris finally lifted his head, meeting my eyes. His gaze was empty, tired, but there was something else there, something that made my stomach drop. "We let it go," he said simply. "We let it go a long time ago." The words struck me like a physical blow, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. It wasn't just the end of our relationship that hurt. It was the realization that we had both known it was coming, but neither of us had said anything until now. We had both just let it slip through our fingers, hoping it would fix itself, hoping that the distance between us would somehow close on its own. But it didn't. And now it was too late. I stared at him, trying to find something, anything within him that would make me feel like we could still fix this. But all I saw was the man I used to love, standing there, already halfway out the door. And in that moment, I understood. We were already gone. The next morning, I woke up early. I don't know why. Maybe it was the restless sleep, or maybe it was the knot in my stomach that wouldn't let me rest. The apartment felt different now, like it was holding its breath. The quiet was suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to break it. Chris was still in bed, but his side was empty. He'd left in the night without saying a word. I should have known he would. The signs had been there, hadn't they? The silence, the distance, the way we'd stopped really looking at each other. I pushed myself out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. The apartment was still, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the distant cars on the street. I glanced at the kitchen table, where the remains of our anniversary dinner sat. Half-eaten, forgotten. It felt like the night had never really happened. Like we'd been playing roles, pretending that things were fine when they weren't. I didn't know what I was supposed to do now. I didn't know how to fix this, or even if it could be fixed. Part of me wanted to just keep pretending, to act like everything was okay. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I walked over to the coffee maker, the motion automatic. The smell of brewing coffee filled the room, familiar and comforting. But even the scent couldn't make things feel normal. I could still feel the weight of the conversation from last night hanging over us. The things we didn't say, the things we couldn't say. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Chris stepped into the kitchen. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled. He didn't look at me, just moved toward the counter. "I'm making coffee," I said, my voice quiet. I wasn't sure why I said it. Maybe I thought it would break the silence. He nodded, his movement slow. He grabbed a mug from the cabinet, but didn't speak. For a moment, we just stood there, each of us pretending the other wasn't there. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. Not after what happened last night. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "Chris, we need to talk." He didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared down at the counter, his fingers tracing the edge of the countertop. "I don't think we have anything left to talk about," he said, his voice flat. The words stung, but I knew he was right. We hadn't had anything left to say for a long time. "Are you just going to leave?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "Is that what you're going to do?" He finally looked up, his eyes empty, tired. "I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." That hurt more than anything else. To hear him say he didn't know. To hear him admit that he didn't have a plan. I wanted to scream, to tell him that we could still fix this, that we could find a way back. But I couldn't. I knew I couldn't. Instead, I just nodded, trying to hold back the tears. "I don't know either." The silence fell again, heavy and thick, and for a moment, it felt like we were back to square one, the same place we'd been the night before, stuck, unsure, unable to move forward or backward. Finally, Chris grabbed his mug, his hand shaking slightly. He looked at me one last time, but his eyes were distant, like he was already somewhere else. "I'm going to go for a walk," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't say anything as he turned and left. I stood there, staring at the door for a long time after he was gone. What was left for us? What was left to say? I spent the rest of the morning pacing. It wasn't like me to feel this restless, but every corner of the apartment felt like it was closing in on me. I couldn't stay still, couldn't get comfortable. My mind kept replaying the same questions. What happened? How did we get here? The coffee had gone cold on the counter. I hadn't even touched it. I tried to distract myself, but everything seemed to remind me of Chris. The old photos on the shelves, the dishes in the sink, the empty chair across from mine at the kitchen table. Every little thing was a reminder of what was slipping away. I should have gone after him. I should have stopped him before he left. But part of me knew it wouldn't have mattered. We were both too far gone, too far removed from each other. I glanced at my phone, but there was no message, no call. Not that I expected one. Chris had never been one for words when it came to big decisions. He'd always been the type to leave things unsaid, to hope the silence would somehow fix everything. But silence never fixed anything. It only made the cracks more obvious. I threw on a jacket and decided to go out for a walk. I needed to clear my head, needed to be anywhere but here. The streets outside were busy, people going about their day, lost in their own worlds. It felt strange to be walking among them, as if the world was moving in one direction, while I stood still, unable to keep up. I tried not to think about Chris, but I couldn't help it. The empty space beside me, the place that used to be filled with his presence, seemed to grow larger with every step. I reached the park after a while, the fresh air feeling like a small relief. I found a bench near the pond and sat down, staring at the water. It wasn't much, just a small pond surrounded by trees, but it was quiet here. The peace of it almost felt like an illusion. I pulled my phone out again, hoping maybe there would be a message, some sign that he was thinking about this, about us. But there was nothing. I felt stupid for checking, but I couldn't stop myself. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in my chest. I told myself that I was doing the right thing, that maybe we both needed space. But every minute without hearing from him made it harder to believe that. I stared at the screen for a few more seconds, then locked my phone and shoved it back into my pocket. I couldn't keep waiting for him to fix this. I stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. The longer I sat, the more I knew that things wouldn't get better just by waiting for them to. We needed to talk. We needed to face whatever this was. The silence between us wasn't just uncomfortable now. It was suffocating. I headed back home, my pace quickening with every step. As I walked through the door, I half expected Chris to be there, sitting on the couch, waiting for me. But the apartment was still, silent, empty, I stood in the doorway for a long time, unsure of what to do next. There was nothing left to say. We had both been avoiding the inevitable, trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. I felt my heart sink. What if it was really over? The apartment felt even emptier when I returned. I don't know why I thought it would feel different. The silence still hung heavy, and there was no sign of Chris. It was almost like he had never been there at all. I dropped my keys on the table, the sound of them hitting the wood strangely loud in the quiet. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty room. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, anything to break the silence. But I didn't. I just stood there, trying to collect my thoughts, trying to figure out what to do next. I went to the kitchen and opened the fridge, hoping the mundane act of making lunch would help me clear my head. I pulled out some leftovers from last night, but the food felt pointless. Everything felt pointless. I couldn't stop thinking about Chris. Where had he gone? Why hadn't he come back? Was he avoiding me, or was he just done? I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my hands felt shaky as I set the food on the counter. The kitchen had once been the heart of our home. We would cook dinner together, laugh, talk about our day. But now it felt like a place I barely recognized. It was just another room in an apartment that was becoming more and more foreign to me. I heard the door open before I saw him. Chris walked in, his face tired, eyes a little bloodshot like he hadn't slept. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at me like he was weighing something in his mind. "Where were you?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to sound so cold, but I couldn't help it. The hurt had made me numb. Chris shrugged like it was no big deal. "Out." I felt my chest tighten. "Out where?" He didn't answer right away, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to. But then he spoke, his voice quiet and rough. "I just needed some space to think." I nodded, though I didn't understand. Space. It had become his word of choice. Space to think. Space to breathe. But what about me? What about us? I turned away, not wanting him to see how much it hurt. I could feel the anger and frustration rising in me, but I swallowed it down. I didn't want to argue, not now. Not when I knew deep down that it wouldn't make any difference. "We need to talk," I said, my voice more steady than I felt. Chris sighed, his eyes moving to the floor. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't had a good night's sleep in days. "I don't know if there's anything left to say." The words stung, but I had to push through. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "I know we're both just avoiding it," I said, turning to face him. "But we can't keep doing this, Chris. We can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." Chris's jaw tightened, and he ran a hand through his hair. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know how to fix this." I shook my head, feeling the tears start to sting my eyes. "Neither do I, but ignoring it isn't helping. It's just making it worse." He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might say something, anything, that would make me believe things could get better. But he didn't. Instead, he just stared at me, like he was seeing me for the first time, but also like he was already preparing to let go. "I don't know if we can fix this," he said, his voice so quiet I could barely hear it. "I don't know if it's worth fixing." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Worth fixing? Was that what we had come to? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with finality. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't want to give up on us," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "I don't want to walk away." He looked away then, his gaze moving to the window, like he was searching for something outside the apartment. Anything to avoid looking at me. "I'm not sure what we're holding on to anymore," he said quietly. The silence that followed was unbearable. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. The space between us felt infinite, like there was no way to bridge the gap anymore. The words we needed to say, the ones that could save us, were already buried beneath all the other things we hadn't said, the things we couldn't say. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just stood there, my heart breaking a little more with every second of silence. "We're already done, aren't we?" I whispered, the question escaping before I could stop it. Chris didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring out the window, his shoulders slumped, and then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. And just like that, it was over. The door slammed behind him, and the sound echoed in the empty apartment. I stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the place where Chris had been just seconds ago. The words he'd said, the look on his face, they all felt like they were pressing down on me, suffocating me. He was gone. The thought circled in my mind, repeating over and over until I couldn't escape it. He was gone. And there was nothing I could do to fix it. I sank onto the couch, my head heavy with everything we hadn't said, with everything that was left unresolved. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to make sense of it all, but the pieces didn't fit. Nothing made sense anymore. The room around me felt even more suffocating than before. The silence was oppressive, like it was pressing in from all sides. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic outside, but it all felt like background noise, insignificant compared to the emptiness I felt inside. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but it didn't help. My heart was pounding, my chest tight, and the ache in my stomach was relentless. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were supposed to be different. We were supposed to make it. I thought we could fight through the rough patches, that we could hold on to each other when things got hard. But now, I wasn't sure what we had left. I took a shaky breath and opened my eyes, glancing around the room. The apartment that had once felt like a home now felt like a place I didn't recognize. It was like a stranger's space, one I was only visiting. I got up, needing to do something, anything to distract myself from the pain. I walked over to the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines of the books. Each one felt like a memory, a fragment of something that had once mattered. But none of it mattered now. None of it could bring him back. I pulled a book off the shelf, but it felt heavy in my hands, like it was weighing me down. I didn't want to read. I didn't want to escape into a world of fiction when my own reality was crumbling. Instead, I set the book down and moved to the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where Chris used to stand when he cooked. The space that now felt cold and unfamiliar. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, lost in thought. Time had become meaningless. It could have been an hour or a minute. I couldn't tell. I picked up my phone, my finger hovering over Chris's contact, but I didn't press it. I couldn't. I had nothing left to say. I couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. I put the phone down, feeling the weight of my decisions settling over me. There was no going back. Not now. Not after everything we'd said. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, a deep, bone-deep tiredness that made it hard to stand. I needed sleep, but I didn't know if I could sleep in a world without him. I walked to the bedroom, my movements slow and heavy, like I was moving through thick mud. The bed felt too big now, too empty. I slid under the covers, pulling them tight around me as if it would somehow protect me from the ache in my chest. The quiet was deafening. I closed my eyes, trying to find some peace, some comfort. But all I could see was his face, the way he looked at me before he left, like he had already made up his mind, like he had already given up. I took a deep breath, willing myself to sleep, but the tears came anyway. I tried to stop them, but I couldn't. They came without warning, pouring out of me like a dam had burst, each one a reminder of how much I had lost. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I was never going to get him back. Not after this. Not after we had let it all slip away. The sun had barely risen when I woke up, the light filtering weakly through the blinds. It had been days since Chris left, and each one felt like a slow drag through mud. I couldn't remember the last time I felt this empty. I blinked at the ceiling, the quiet so thick it seemed to press in on me, suffocating. My thoughts were a jumble, and no matter how hard I tried to focus on something, anything, I couldn't escape the constant reminder of what I had lost. The bed felt too big now. It wasn't supposed to feel this way. I had once felt safe here, beside him. But now, the space between us was an abyss, one I couldn't cross, no matter how much I wanted to. I sat up, my head heavy, eyes sore from the lack of sleep. I ran a hand through my tangled hair and glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. I hadn't even noticed the time until now. I slipped out of bed and dragged myself to the bathroom, barely looking at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked unfamiliar, pale, hollowed out. I splashed some cold water on my face, hoping it would wake me up, but it only made things worse. The mirror showed the same tired eyes that had been staring back at me for days, and I hated what I saw. I hated how much I had changed. I needed to move. I needed to do something. I grabbed my phone, almost instinctively, but then paused. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the contact list. I knew I couldn't call him, I knew that. But the temptation was there. It was always there, like a ghost that refused to leave. Instead, I locked the phone and shoved it back into my pocket. No messages, no calls, just the silent void that had replaced everything between us. I made coffee, though it felt pointless. I watched the steam rise from the mug, but it didn't comfort me. It didn't do anything. The apartment was still. It had always been still, but now it felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to break. And part of me was already broken. I knew that. I wandered into the living room, my steps slow, dragging. I went to the bookshelf and ran my fingers over the spines of the books, but I couldn't bring myself to pull one down. I thought about the things we used to do together, how we used to read on the couch, sharing our favorite stories, laughing about silly things. Now, those memories only made everything worse. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty space beside me. It felt like a vacuum. No matter where I looked, I couldn't escape the absence of him. The emptiness felt like it was swallowing me whole. The days had blurred together. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, or if any of it mattered. All I knew was that I missed him. I missed everything about him. The way he smiled when he walked through the door, the way his hand would find mine in the middle of the night, the soft murmur of his voice in the mornings. I missed us, but that was a reality I couldn't reach anymore. That was a world that didn't exist. I stood up suddenly, the restlessness crawling under my skin again. I needed to get out of this apartment, away from the walls that felt like they were closing in on me. I grabbed my coat, threw it on, and left without thinking. The cool air outside hit me like a slap, and for a moment, it felt like I could breathe again. The streets were busy, people rushing past me, lost in their own lives, their own routines. I walked without a destination in mind, letting my feet guide me. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just trying to fill the silence with something. Anything. I passed the park, the same one I'd walked through before, and paused. It was quiet now, empty except for a few people sitting on benches. It seemed like the whole world had a way of moving on, while I was still stuck, standing in the same place. I found a bench and sat down, pulling my coat tighter around me. I didn't feel cold, though. I didn't feel much of anything at all. The people around me didn't seem to notice me, lost in their own thoughts, in their own worlds. It was almost like I was invisible. I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle over me. The sound of birds in the trees, the distant hum of traffic. It was all so distant, so irrelevant. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. A thought crossed my mind. Maybe I could just leave. Get away from everything. Start over somewhere else. But where would I go? And what would I do? I didn't have an answer. I opened my eyes and watched the leaves rustle in the wind. The world kept moving, even when you weren't ready to move with it. The pain was still there. The ache in my chest hadn't gone away. But somehow, sitting there in the park, I felt like I was finally starting to see the bigger picture. Life didn't stop just because I was stuck. It didn't stop for anyone. I stood up after a while, the decision settling in. I wasn't sure what came next, or if anything would ever feel right again, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I walked back home, each step feeling a little lighter, like I was finally making progress. The door to the apartment opened with a creak as I stepped inside. I looked around again, the silence greeting me like an old friend. But something was different now. I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was just the walk, or maybe it was the simple realization that I had to keep moving forward, no matter how painful it felt. But I knew one thing for sure. Things weren't going to get better overnight. And that was okay. I would take it one step at a time. The next morning, the weight of everything still hung heavy in the air. I woke up, as usual, but this time I didn't feel the pull of yesterday's sorrow. The heaviness was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was different now. It felt more like a dull ache than a sharp pain. I sat up in bed, the quiet of the apartment pressing in on me. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin streams, casting soft patterns on the floor. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. Peace had become a foreign concept to me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, staring at the floor. My thoughts swirled like a storm, all of them tangled together, making it impossible to focus on any one thing. Chris had been gone for days now, and yet it still felt like he was here. It felt like I could reach out and touch him, but the space between us was an unbridgeable distance. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. I didn't want coffee today. I didn't want anything, but I found myself standing in front of the counter, trying to fill the emptiness with something. Anything. I opened the cabinet and pulled out a mug, the motion automatic, like I had done it 1,000 times before. The kettle whistled, the sound sharp against the silence. I poured the hot water into the mug and let it sit there for a moment, watching the steam rise. The simple action, the routine of it, felt comforting in a strange way. But then, just as quickly, that comfort disappeared. It was fleeting. Nothing felt steady anymore. Nothing was what it used to be. I set the mug down on the counter and walked to the living room, my eyes falling on the empty space beside me on the couch. It hit me like a wave. This was my new reality now. This space, this apartment, this life. It was all mine now, alone. I hadn't realized how much I had relied on Chris, how much I had let him become a part of my daily routine. Now that he was gone, I felt lost. The silence was suffocating. I tried to fill the void by reaching for my phone, but before I could unlock it, I stopped. What was the point? There were no texts, no messages, no calls. There was nothing left to say. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for anymore, but whatever it wasn't coming. Not now. Not after everything. I let out a deep breath, pushing the phone aside. Instead, I grabbed my coat and went outside. The cool air hit my face, a small shock to my senses. I needed the world outside. I needed to feel something that wasn't this suffocating silence. The streets were busy, but I felt detached from it all. People rushed past me, caught up in their own lives, their own routines. They didn't know what I was going through, and honestly, I didn't want them to. I didn't want anyone to know. I walked aimlessly, not sure where I was headed. The city was still waking up, the streets lined with cafes opening their doors, the sound of footsteps echoing against the pavement. Everything felt both distant and too close at the same time. I ended up at the park again, the same bench where I'd sat yesterday. It wasn't intentional, but it felt familiar, like a place where I could let my thoughts settle without the pressure of anyone else. I sat down and pulled my coat tighter around me. The park was quiet today, fewer people than yesterday. The birds were still chirping, the trees still swaying in the light breeze, but it all felt muted, like I was watching the world through a fogged window. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. It felt grounding, like I could almost forget the weight of everything if I just focused on the present. But the silence, the loneliness, crept back in. I couldn't escape it. I opened my eyes and watched the people around me. There was a young couple sitting on a bench across from me, holding hands and talking softly to each other. Their laughter was light, carefree. It reminded me of what I had lost, of what I once had. I looked away quickly, not wanting to let the bitterness take root. I stood up after a while, feeling the need to move again. I walked back home, my feet moving faster now, the need to fill the empty space growing stronger. The apartment was still as I walked inside. The silence was almost unbearable now. I was beginning to hate it, the way it crept into every corner, the way it followed me from room to room. I didn't know how to live in it anymore. I went to the bedroom and sat on the bed. I ran my hands over the sheets, feeling the emptiness of it all. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, maybe some sign, some clarity, but it wasn't coming. I let out a slow breath and stood up. I had to keep going. I had to find a way to live without him, to find something that could fill the void. But how do you fill a space that's too big for anything to fill? I grabbed my jacket again and went for a walk. I needed to keep moving, keep doing. Because if I stopped, even for a moment, I knew I would drown in the silence. And I wasn't ready for that yet. I didn't go to work. I didn't call in sick, didn't send a message, didn't even check my emails. I just didn't go. Instead, I spent the morning lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the minutes pass like slow-moving shadows. The weight of the silence in the apartment had started pressing down on me in a way I couldn't ignore. It filled the empty spaces, settled into the walls, crept into my chest. I thought about turning on the TV, playing music, calling someone, anything to drown it out. But none of it felt right. It wasn't just silence. It was his absence. And that wasn't something I could just tune out. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I got up, showered, dressed in something that wasn't just pajamas. The motions were mechanical, like I was running on autopilot. My body knew what to do, even if my mind felt disconnected. When I walked into the kitchen, I caught myself pulling out 2 coffee mugs. It was automatic, a habit. One for me, one for him. I stopped, stared at them. My chest tightened. For a moment, I just stood there, gripping the counter, trying to breathe through it. It was stupid, such a small, meaningless thing, but it hit me harder than I expected. I put 1 mug back, poured my coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and I told myself to drink it. Drink it, Emma. Just drink the damn coffee. But my stomach was in knots. My hands felt too unsteady. I pushed the mug aside, untouched. I needed to get out. The city felt different today. Or maybe I was different. I walked with no destination, weaving through streets and crowds like a ghost. Everything moved around me. Cars, voices, laughter. But it didn't feel real, like I was watching it all through glass. At some point, I ended up in front of our bookstore, the one we used to go to on slow Sunday mornings, where he'd lose himself in shelves of poetry, while I wandered through the fiction section, running my fingers along spines, searching for stories that felt like home. I almost turned away, almost kept walking, but something made me step inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, and a wave of familiarity washed over me. The warm scent of paper and old wood, the quiet hum of jazz playing from an unseen speaker. It was all the same. And yet, nothing was the same. I traced the edges of books without really seeing them, my feet moving without thought. I found myself in the poetry section, his section. And then, like the universe had a cruel sense of humor, my eyes landed on a book I knew too well. Chris had loved this one. He'd read it to me once, sitting on our balcony late at night, his voice soft, words heavy with meaning. I still remembered the way he'd looked at me when he read that last line, like he was searching for something, like he already knew. My fingers hovered over the cover. I shouldn't have picked it up, but I did. The book fell open in my hands, the spine already worn from too much love. And there it was, the passage he had read to me that night. People don't leave all at once. They leave in pieces, in echoes, in the spaces they used to fill. I sucked in a breath, but it got caught in my throat. The weight of it hit me like a punch. I slammed the book shut, shoved it back on the shelf, turned on my heel, and walked out. Back at the apartment, I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the space we used to share. I thought leaving would help, that maybe, if I kept moving, I could outrun this feeling. But grief wasn't something you could escape. It clung to you, followed you, lived in the places they left behind. I let out a shaky breath and walked inside. And for the first time since he left, I didn't turn on any lights. I let the darkness settle around me. I let the silence in, and I let myself feel it. I didn't dream that night. Or maybe I did, but I didn't remember. All I knew was that I woke up feeling hollow, not rested, not refreshed, just awake. I lay in bed for a long time, my body refusing to move, my mind trapped in that strange space between sleep and consciousness. The kind where reality doesn't feel quite real yet, where for a few fleeting seconds, you forget everything that's happened. And then it all comes crashing back. Chris was gone. The silence was still here. The weight in my chest hadn't lifted. I sighed, pushing the blankets off. The apartment was cold. Not physically, but in the way empty spaces feel when no one else is there to fill them. I wrapped my arms around myself as I walked into the living room. It was still dark outside, the city just beginning to stir. For some reason, I found myself standing in front of the closet. It was the only part of the apartment I hadn't touched since he left. Everything else I had adjusted, even if only slightly, moved a pillow here, cleared a space there, little things. But the closet? That was untouched. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle. I wasn't ready for this. I knew that. But I opened it anyway. The scent hit me first. Faint, but still there. His cologne, his laundry detergent, the subtle, familiar smell of him that had once been woven into my everyday life. My throat tightened. His clothes were still hanging neatly on his side, undisturbed. Jackets, shirts, sweaters, the pieces of him that remained. A reminder that, at one point, this had been his home too. I reached out, fingertips brushing against the sleeve of his favorite hoodie. The one he always wore on lazy Sundays. The one I used to steal when I was cold, even though he always pretended to be annoyed about it. I pulled it off the hanger before I could stop myself, held it in my hands, and then, before I could think too hard about it, I slipped it on. It was too big, swallowing me whole. But that was the point. It still carried the shape of him, the warmth of something that used to be ours. I pressed the sleeves to my face, inhaling deeply. And that's when it happened. The first tear, slow, silent, sliding down my cheek before I even realized I was crying. Then another, and another, until I was standing there, drowning in fabric and memories, unable to hold it all in any longer. I sank to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and I let myself break. I must have sat there for hours, long enough for the city to wake, for the light to shift, for the shadows in the room to change. At some point, the tears stopped. Not because the grief was gone, but because I was empty. I wiped my face with my sleeve and let out a shaky breath. And then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I started cleaning. Not in the frantic, desperate way some people do when they want to erase someone's presence. I wasn't trying to make it seem like he had never been here. I wasn't trying to forget. I was just making space. I folded the clothes he left behind, stacked them neatly, put some aside in a box, not to throw away, but to keep. Because some things you don't just let go of. I moved slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not forcing, just letting myself exist in the motion of it all. And by the time I was done, I realized something. The apartment still felt empty, but for the first time, it didn't feel hollow. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. The apartment felt different. Not lighter exactly, but less suffocating. The closet was still half full, Chris's clothes neatly folded in a box now. I hadn't gotten rid of them. I wasn't ready for that. But something about packing them away, making space, had settled something inside me. It was strange how grief worked. Some days, it was a crushing weight, pinning me to the bed, stealing the air from my lungs. Other days, it was just a quiet ache, a dull hum beneath everything. Today was one of those days. The ache was still there, but it wasn't drowning me. I made coffee, drank it this time, let the warmth sit in my chest, grounding me. And then I did something I had been avoiding for weeks. I picked up my phone. There were notifications, missed calls, texts I had ignored. Work, friends, a couple from my mom asking if I was okay. I should have answered them. Should have sent at least one "I'm fine" message. But instead, my thumb hovered over another name. Chris. I knew it was pointless. He wasn't calling. He wasn't texting. But his name was still in my recent calls, still sitting there like it was waiting for me to do something. I swallowed, my pulse picking up as I tapped it. The call history opened. And that's when I saw it. A voicemail. My breath caught. My fingers went numb. I stared at the tiny icon, the timestamp from weeks ago, my mind scrambling to remember when he had left it. I hadn't noticed it before, Or maybe I had, but I hadn't been able to face it. Now, I wasn't sure if I could, but my thumb moved before I could stop it. I pressed play. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then, his voice. "Hey." A pause. A breath. I don't really know why I'm calling. I guess I don't know. I didn't want to leave things like that. My stomach twisted. "I know you're mad, and you have every right to be. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for leaving. I think we both know it had to happen. But for the way it happened. For how I handled it. For hurting you." I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse a dull roar in my ears. "I don't know what to say to make this better. Maybe nothing can. But I don't want you to think I didn't love you, Emma. Because I did. I do. You were everything to me." A shaky exhale. "But sometimes love isn't enough, you know?" The words hit me like a fist to the ribs. Chris let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Anyway, I don't even know if you'll listen to this. But if you do, just know that I never wanted to be the reason you stopped believing in love. You deserve better than that." A beat of silence. Then, soft, almost too quiet. "Goodbye, Emma." The line clicked dead. I sat there, staring at the screen, the weight of his voice still wrapped around me. I should have been angry, should have thrown the phone across the room, screamed at the walls, cursed him for leaving, for still finding ways to break my heart even now. But all I felt was tired and hollow and so unbearably sad, because for the first time since he left, I finally understood. I didn't move for a long time. The phone sat on the table, the screen dark now, as if it hadn't just changed everything. Chris's voice still echoed in my head, the way it cracked when he said my name, the way he breathed through his words, as if he had to steady himself just to say them. Sometimes love isn't enough. I had spent weeks drowning in my own anger, convincing myself that he had abandoned me, that he had walked away because I wasn't worth staying for. But that voicemail, it was proof of something else. He had loved me, I had loved him, but we had failed anyway, and somehow that hurt more. I got up, moving on autopilot. My limbs felt heavy, my chest tight, but I needed to do something. Sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and I wasn't ready for that. So I cleaned. Not just the closet this time, the whole apartment. I scrubbed the counters, wiped down the coffee table, sorted through the pile of unopened mail by the door. I swept the floors, then mopped them, cleaned the mirrors, the windows, the places I had neglected for too long. It wasn't about erasing him. It wasn't about pretending he had never lived here, never filled this space with his voice, his laughter, his presence. It was about reclaiming something. Because for weeks, I had let the grief take over. I had let the weight of his absence press down on me until I could barely breathe. But this was still my home. And I needed to start treating it like one again. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon. I stood in the center of the living room, hands on my hips, taking in the difference. It wasn't drastic, but it was noticeable. The air felt fresher. The light felt warmer. The space no longer felt like a museum of what used to be. Something in my chest loosened. I turned toward the kitchen, ready to make something, anything to eat. But as I did, my eyes landed on the box by the couch. Chris's things. I swallowed. I could have left it there, could have ignored it for another few weeks. But something told me I shouldn't. Not this time. I knelt beside it, tracing the edges of the cardboard. And then, carefully, I lifted the lid. It was strange how objects could hold so much weight. A sweater. A book he never finished. A couple of Polaroids, edges curled from being tucked into his wallet. A keychain from a trip we took 2 summers ago, when everything still felt easy. and at the bottom, his journal. I hadn't expected that. Chris had always been a private person. He wasn't the kind to pour his heart onto a page, to leave behind written proof of his thoughts. But here it was. I hesitated, my fingers brushing over the worn leather cover. This wasn't mine. Whatever was inside, he had never intended for me to read. But he had left it, and that felt like an invitation. My heart pounded as I flipped it open. His handwriting was familiar, sharp, slanted, a little messy. I skimmed the first few pages, dated over a year ago. Random thoughts, work notes, nothing significant. But then I turned to the middle, and I found my name. Hey, Emma thinks I don't notice when she starts pulling away, but I do. She doesn't say it, but I can feel it. The way she looks at me when she thinks I'm not paying attention. The way she hesitates before speaking, like she's measuring every word. My breath caught. I turned the page. I love her. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if she wants me to. The air left my lungs. My hands trembled as I closed the journal, pressing it against my chest. I had spent so long believing I was the only one who had suffered, that he had left me without a second thought. But the truth was here, in ink and paper. Chris had been hurting too, and I had never seen it.